Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are and watching this webinar organized by the Latin American Institute at UCLA. This year, the LAI, as we call the Latin American Institute for short, is organizing series on two countries in Latin America, Bolivia and Paraguay. And today we have the opportunity to hear or to listen, to participate in an event, in a talk on the recent elections, presidential elections in Bolivia, and about the prospects for the new president who was recently inaugurated. By the way, I'm Ruben Hernandez Leon, professor of sociology and director of the Latin American Institute here at UCLA. I will always forget to do that. And I'm going to quite promptly turn it to Gabriel Silva Collins, who is coordinator of the Andean Working Group. He's a graduate student in archaeology, very active. We have a very active Andean Working Group here at the LAI, and we're very, very happy about that. Thank you to our wonderful staff, Brian Pitts, Assistant Director of the Latin American Institute, Ari Barrera, who always are incredibly diligent in the organization and dealing with all the technological ins and outs of this webinar. So, Gabriel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Ruben. Yes, my name is Gabriel Silva Collins, and I'm very grateful to all the LAI has done. And it's my pleasure to introduce Jorge Dirpic, who is in the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Institute of the University of Georgia. And we'll be talking about where Bolivia is heading in the future with its new presidency under Rodrigo Paz in his administration, after 2 decades of nearly uninterrupted rule by the Movimiento al Socialismo. And so, without further ado, let's listen to Bolivia 2025 to 2030. Where is the country headed under Rodrigo Paz's administration? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to the Latin American Institute, particularly to Dr. Ruben Hernandez Leon, to Dr. Pitts, Brian Pitts, to Gabriel Ariadne and Noel Guzman, who are members of the Andean group at UCLA. I really appreciate the invitation. Today, I've been asked to share some thoughts about the path ahead for Bolivia under the new administration of the President now appointed Rodrigo Paz Pereira and Vice President Edmund Lara, who took over the presidency after 20 years of almost uninterrupted rule by the left-wing Movimiento al Socialismo, or MAS, the movement towards socialism. In this talk, I will address some of the main challenges that the new government is facing in some key areas as well, mainly the economy, the justice system, the environment and land. And while doing so, I will also address some questions that emerge about the future of the Bolivian left and the social organizations that have supported and accompanied the party. And then I will conclude with some reflections about some of the signals that we were seeing after only a few days of the government in power, of the new government in power, although there have been some signals that have been emerging during these 3 months between the first round of the elections and the second round that took place in October. So let me start talking a little bit about the economy, and I would like to start by describing a little bit of the situation that the country is facing right now, due to a set of different but concatenated factors. This because I believe that getting a better sense of how things are operating on the ground will help us to understand why are we seeing a shift in the political power of the country over the last year. So to begin with, let me say that over the last year and a half to 2 years, Bolivian citizens have faced several barriers and several issues that they have encountered in their daily lives. The most relevant ones have to do with for instance, repeated oil, gas, and diesel shortages, skyrocketing prices for daily use goods, and lack of dollars in the currency exchange market. The most visible of these issues relates to probably the endless lines of cars and trailers that are trying or waiting to get oil, gas, or diesel at gas stations across the country. They have waited for times that go even up to 24 hours, or in national expressways and roadways to days waiting to get their gas tanks filled. This, of course, is related to a set of issues that are concatenated, as I was saying, one of them being issues with logistics and access to dollars to get oil, gas, and diesel from international sources. The main causes for this current status of the economy have been attributed to declining natural gas exports and revenues, as well as oil, gas, and diesel imports and subsidies. The opposition to the mass that is now in power blames this on what they have called the failure of the socialist model, which is not necessarily accurate. But they have also alleged that there has been mismanagement in the state in general, and especially in the state oil company under the acronym YPFD. Excuse me. In essence, what they're criticizing is the national developmentalist program that was implemented by the MAS over the last 2 decades, which, besides different alternatives of wealth redistribution, such as conditional cash programs or investing in infrastructure for education or health mainly in areas that were electorally aligned with the MAS, strongly emphasized a stronger presence of the state in the economy. This stronger presence was accompanied by a strong rhetoric against neoliberal policies, structural adjustment reforms, austerity measures, and free market policies. So, in this situation, the members of the new administration have already started announcing their plans to, as they call it, stabilize the ship. And they're going to do that by relying on loans from international organizations, such as the World Bank, mainly to cover the most immediate needs of the country, because at this very moment, the government and the Bolivian state is almost broke. We have run out of the central bank reserves that we had accumulated, almost run out of these reserves that we had accumulated during the boom of the commodities in the mid-2000s and until the mid-2010s. And we started selling our gold resources that were also located in the central bank in order to get some cash money, so the government could pay for oil, gas, and other imports. The new administration has also announced that they're going to eliminate oil, gas, and diesel subsidies, which, as it was acknowledged by Evo Morales, even back to, 2010, takes a very big chunk of the amount of money that the government has to spend every year. And the incoming administration has announced that they want to work and sign a new hydrocarbons law that, among other things, will attract foreign investment again. So we're moving from a model that emphasized state control of national companies, strategic companies like the oil company YPFB, to a model that is taking us back to the 1990s and 2000s, where we sort of operated with with certain laxitude, or actually inviting foreign investment, so these companies could help us explore and find new gas resources, and of course making things appealing to them. With Morales in 2006, in a process that lasted for 5 years, after a process that lasted 5 years, the Bolivian government took control of most of the gas resources and was able to generate more revenue based on a new type of taxation and agreements with foreign companies. They call this nationalization. Some people would argue that it wasn't really nationalization. But in the end, it was like better contracts that benefited the country at a moment where gas and international commodity prices were going up. So again, we're going to see a government that is moving towards foreign investment, reduction of the role of the state in managing these natural resources, these strategic natural resources, and trying to recover the economy, stabilize it. They're probably going to make changes with the exchange rate, going to try to get some loans to cover some of our most basic expenses and so on. This in regards to the economy. I would like now to move to the second area that I think it's important for this very moment, which is the justice, the judicial system, which has been in a long-term crisis that goes far back, even beyond the Mas administration, the first Morales administration in 2005. I mean, as far as I have memory, Bolivians have protested against or complained about the inefficiency, the inequality produced in the judicial system. My work, which deals with collective violence in response to crime and the responses that state authorities give to these events in the city of El Alto, has shown me that police investigators, prosecutors, and judges lack of legitimacy among the population that gets caught in their nets and has to deal with them on a daily basis due to the presence of widespread petty or grand corruption, inefficiency, and inequality in general. But in addition to these long-term complaints about the judicial system, over the last 20 years, we have seen this system to shift towards becoming more politicized and actually weaponized against political opponents, depending on who is in power and who is in the opposition. So, for instance, right now, there is a set of members of the Constitutional Tribunal who should have ended their term in 2023 or 2024, but that remain in their positions due to political reasons, and that mainly because they were protected or received protection from the Luis Arce's administration. Some of the measures they took after their official term had ended and was extended include, for instance, banning Evo Morales from running for another presidential election, regardless of whether if this is a consecutive or non-consecutive term. That to just give you one example. But this politicization and weaponization of the judicial system against political opponents, again, has been the mark of the administrations that started in 2005-6 until the present. It marked Morales' administration between 2006 and 2019. Janine Áñez did the same thing in 2019 and 2020. And Arce, when the Mas returned to power in 2020, also used the judicial system to go after political opponents like the governor of Santa Cruz, Camacho, Luis Fernando Camacho, or even Áñez and her ministers and all the people that were part of her government, or a significant number of the people that were part of her government. The most recent example of how this is operating, like this justice system that operates based on the needs of the party in power, is the recent release of precisely the former senator and president of the country, Janine Áñez, who was released from prison just a week ago and had all her judicial processes for the massacres of Sencata and Sacaba, as well as her sentence, an initial sentence, a 10-year sentence for allegedly arriving to power through unconstitutional means in 2019, annulled. So the arguments that the Supreme Court gave to cancel, to annul this sentence and to reverse all the processes for the massacres as well, basically deal with two main ideas. The first one being that she acted as part of a constitutional necessity in the moment of crisis in 2019, when Evo Morales resigned, because there was no one who was going to take over power, and she was the only one enabled to do it. This is sort of like the argument that is being supported by this comment. And then the other one, which I think is more important, is that she was entitled to a trial of responsibilities. I'd be happy to talk more about this specific issue in the Q&A, but for now, let's just say that her case or her sentence, her 10-year sentence, in a sense resonates with what happened to Lula, and why Lula in Brazil was sort of released from prison and was able to run for president again in 2021 or 2022, I believe. Which was because he was trialed in a lower level court that didn't have the power to judge or imprison or to sentence a former president. I'm sure Brian, who's a Brazilianist, will be able to correct me if I'm wrong along those lines. But going back to the judicial reform, to the case of the judicial system and justice in general, as we're seeing, there's been this sort of unstable set of authorities that move to decide or support whoever is in power. And the conversation about the judicial reform that would include one of the main issues that has been discussed over the last years, which is the election by popular vote of the members of the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Tribunal. So this conversation has been going on for about the last, 10 to 15 years. However, these attempts, which sometimes have included national justice summits with actors from civil society, social organizations, grassroots organizations, and state officials that promised profound changes to the judicial system, didn't really materialize, or some of the changes were just cosmetic, very superficial. In the most recent attempt, which took place right after Arce and the MAS returned to power in 2020, it was Evo Morales and his faction who actively thwarted the reform attempts that were initiated by the MAS Ministry of Justice, Lima at that point. And they did it because they wanted to retain the upper hand against the political figures that had persecuted them a year later and that had overthrown Morales in 2019, and that in their view deserved to go to prison as soon as possible. Among these measures, one of them was to decide that Áñez, the former president, should be trialed in a regular court instead of following the procedure for a trial of responsibilities. The new composition of the Legislative Assembly in this term that started on Saturday, where the MAS only, and its allies or people who would align with the principles of the left, hold less than 10% of the seats, along with some statements by the leaders of the main political parties in Congress, such as Samuel Doria Medina or Jorge Tuto Quiroga, suggest that a reform in the justice system, and especially the popular vote item, will be in the agenda sooner rather than later. Besides the structural reform of the justice system that we will probably see, it remains to be seen, and this is mainly in political terms, if or at what point the judicial system will mobilize or will act against the former authorities from the MAS. This will include most likely prosecuting Evo Morales, who has been accused of who has received credible accusations of statutory rape. The reason for which he's currently secluded in an area of the Cochabamba tropics, surrounded and protected by members of the 6 Cocalif federations, which he still presides. The past administration seems to be taking things slowly in these efforts to go after the MAS or Evo Morales, which in effect is the same strategy that Luis Arce and his government took when they returned to power in 2020. They waited until after the subnational elections to fully start a crackdown against Janine Áñez. But again, we'll have to see at what point the pressures from their constituents, the parties that are dominating the Legislative Assembly, and probably international actors as well, are going to force the government to act against corruption by former authorities of the MAS or the pressures that they're going to feel regarding the monopoly on violence or state sovereignty, that the protection of Evo Morales, who is unwilling to present himself in the justice system even to declare, are raising against the past administration. So we may see some reaction in that sense, depending on the pressures that emerge, to preserve the monopoly on violence for the state, or to preserve the state sovereignty across the entire territory. Because there's the sense today that coca leaf growers are operating in sort of out of state environment, which it's made worse by the presence of narco trafficking that benefits from coca leaf to a large extent. The third item I wanted to touch on, and this is going to be rather brief, relates to the environment and land redistribution in the country, which were two of the main items in the discourse of the mass from the beginning of Morales' administration in 2005, and were sort of consolidated in a pro-environmental and redistributive legal framework that emerged with the 2009 Bolivian Constitution. However, despite this framework, despite these pro-environmental discourses mostly happening outside of the country, extensive and intensive extractivism, either for private gain or to strengthen the state apparatus have persisted. Over the last few years, gold mining in particular, and mining in general, but also cattle ranching and soy production, have benefited several private actors, many of which are also from China. Besides these private entrepreneurs, or among the private entrepreneurs, Bolivian cooperative miners and agribusiness elites in the highlands and in the lowlands of the country have managed to circumvent the little, if any, state regulation and penalties from the government due to their actions. Some of these actions involve mercury and lead contamination in very high levels. There's some of them taking place in mid-sized cities like Viacha, close to La Paz and El Alto. There have also been confrontations between cooperative miners and indigenous peoples for the seizure and control of mining areas and in local communities. And there have also been widespread fires across the country that have sought, or mainly in the lowlands of the country, that have sought to expand the agricultural frontier. So if with the mass administrations, things didn't look bright, as we're seeing right now with all these items that I am mentioning, the first signals of the mass of the past administration suggest that we're potentially facing an even darker scenario. Some of the people that he appointed in key positions related to these matters belong or have strong ties to the agribusiness and economic elites. Some of them participated in the 2019 administration by Janine Áñez, while others ran the country in the 1990s and the early 2000s during neoliberal times. Even more concerning is the decision to sort of eliminate or place the Ministry of Water and the Environment under a new ministry. Sorry, I'm looking at the note here by Brian about the questions. Under this premise of shrinking the state apparatus, which is following the neoliberal, as we call it, mantra, right? Like, we need to reduce the state, we need to reduce the expenses, and all of that. In this context, the outlook specifically, or especially for indigenous peoples, even speaking administratively, for the 8 indigenous autonomies that have been recognized in the country so far, is equally uncertain and far from optimistic, I would say. Because if with the mass they struggle so much to get this status of becoming indigenous autonomies, it looks like the road or the hill they're going to be, the situation is going to be way more uphill for them with the administration of Paz Pereira. Let me now move to, I know I have like 8 to 9 minutes. Let me move on to the situation of the left and social organizations. So there is a strong core base that is still loyal to Evo Morales. And we saw this basically mainly in the results of the first round of the elections. We can also attribute some of this strong support or alignment with Morales' idea to the vote that Paz and mainly his Vice President Edmund Lara received in the runoff election. And this is thanks to, I would say, the sustained work of Evo Morales to engage with local organizations across the country. Until it was no longer possible, he did it face to face. And I believe that now he's still doing it through social media or some of the tools that we can now use to present from Georgia while people are here in California. It seems that this base is mostly located in rural areas and mid-sized or small municipalities across the country, which give Morales still a weakened but is still significant base of support that can be mobilized either electorally or for social protest, to say something. The big question is if this base will be able to reunite or align again with the large number of urban voters that, well, supported Morales and the MAS for a while, but that in the last election supported Paz and Lara. Probably because neither the option presented for the MAS or the alternative of Andrónico Rodriguez really resonated with them. Precisely about Rodriguez, there is also the question of what's going to happen with that faction or the faction that supported Rodriguez, who has been endorsed by middle and upper class intellectual elites that were part of the MAS over the last 20 years. Among them is Álvaro García Linera, Morales' former vice president, as well as some of García Linera's followers. He has a core group of followers who were also authorities, either in Congress, in the Legislative Assembly, or in the government, and who promoted Andrónico Rodriguez's failed candidacy to the presidency. Regarding social organizations, which were offered concentrated and sustained support to the MAS for almost 2 decades, their situation is equally uncertain in the sense that they have been divided or further divided, I would say, over the last few years, mainly because of this dispute between the MAS that followed Arce and the government and the MAS that wanted to have Evo Morales as their candidate again. But this was a process that started early on when even Evo Morales cracked down against the leaders of the National Organization of Indigenous Peoples back in 2011, 2012. The CONAMAC, I'm not sure if I'm translating this correctly, is the National Council of Ayllus and Marcas of the Collasuyo, whose leaders were sidelined. They had a parallel organization aligned with the government established. They were kicked out from their offices, and in the long term, they just faded, and because there was no possibilities of renewal and no resources. So this same practice was applied against Morales' followers or the organizations, the leaderships of these organizations that followed Morales. And in this sense, this is why the National Peasants or the Workers' Federations, rural settlers, urban grassroots organizations like the famous FEJUVE in La Paz, in El Alto, or even the factions of coca leaf growers, although there's a core base that's very connected to Morales and very loyal to Morales in Cochabamba. The ones that were in the traditional area of coca leaf growing located in Los Yungas in La Paz have been against Morales since 2017, and they were highly repressed by the Arce administration. And now they have a representative in the Legislative Assembly who is going to try to change the coca law, which started the confrontation with the government back in 2017. So these organizations, in a few words, again, are divided. They have different leaders, parallel leaderships, and now we have to see and wait and see who are they going to align with. But these organizations tend to also be very pragmatic in a sense. So it wouldn't be surprising to see them establishing certain pacts to coexist with the PAS and Lara administration in exchange of receiving certain benefits that would favor them. But there's also the chance that they could initiate protests that would undermine the government. So after this general overview of some of the, I would say, the most pressing topics or the most pressing areas for the government right now, or for Bolivia right now, and the most pressing issues in the agenda, plus the situation of the left and the social organizations that supported them, I would like to just conclude with a short evaluation of the first few days of the PAS's administration. And of course, I will be happy to answer any questions that come up during the Q&A. One thing that has come very clearly is the composition of the executive power, which has now a set of economic experts that have either been trained abroad or have experience working abroad or have worked with the administrations that ran the country before the arrival of the MAS in 2005. So this suggests that they are seeking or they're pursuing an agenda that will basically seek to reduce the state apparatus, the deficit. They're going to want to move towards austerity measures and attract foreign investment. So this is the neoliberal canon and mantra in a nutshell. And it looks like that's what we're going to be seeing, or that's where this administration is going to be going. This is not entirely surprising because PAS has been aligned with sort of the opposition with the MAS over his career as a senator and then as a governor in his department, which is the equivalent of states here in the US, the Department of Tarija. But he's also been able to establish negotiations and pacts with the MAS, like non-aggression pacts with the MAS. But due to his pragmatism, we can see certain shifts. Like, for instance, he campaigned being one of the very few members of the opposition or candidates of the opposition who claimed that he was not going to make any deals with the International Monetary Fund because of the memory that we have in Bolivia of 2003 and the gas war and that period that later ended with Morales as president. However, he's already meeting with the World Bank, with the Corporación Andina de Fomento. He has secured some funding from the Corporación Andina de Fomento. So it wouldn't be surprising if we see, I wouldn't be surprised if we see him establishing new alliances with the International Monetary Fund, or having the IMF guiding the economic policy in the country in the next few years. He has also met with higher level authorities in the United States. His alignment to the US government is very clear. He met with Marco Rubio a couple of weeks ago. He has announced his willingness to collaborate with the DEA, who have been ousted since 2008. And we may expect like an official return of the DEA at some point. He's also announced that he wants to, or stated that he wants to reestablish ambassadors with the US. So in this sense, he's also showing some strong alignment with current conservative administrations, one of them being the United States, but also with Bukele and Milei, who was present in his appointment on Saturday. At the same time, again, emphasizing his pragmatism, PAS seems to be now regulating his moves against what is left of the MAS, no pun intended, against the MAS or Morales or the left in general, and the legacy of the plurinational state that emerged in 2009 with the Constitution. looks like he doesn't want to unnecessarily kick the hornet's nest and start a wave of mobilization that could weaken him. So, speaking in concrete terms, I don't think he will move towards changing the constitution right now, or like changing the name of the country, or even going after Morales or people from the mass, at least not in this first few months, to avoid a wave of protest that would weaken him right from the outset. Because if he is conscious, I believe him and his party or the members of his government are conscious of, is that the votes that he received, even though they gave him and the opposition, the former opposition to the mass parties, almost full control of the legislative assembly, he knows that at least the votes that he received for the Democratic Christian Party are not entirely his. And he knows that given the right conditions, these votes could shift to the opposite side, either in the polls or on the streets. So I think he's taking things with a certain degree of caution to prevent generating issues that would potentially undermine him at this point. But he, based on this urgency and the necessity of stabilizing the country, stabilizing the ship, we can see some structural adjustment measures, austerity measures that will probably generate some reaction from the population. But I guess they're going to try to make those as easy and smooth as possible, just to not generate something that would end up in another overthrown president in the long history of overthrown presidents in Bolivia. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jorge, for your talk. We really, really appreciate you spending your time to join us and give us this information. We just want to say also, again, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A function, and I will start reading them out loud. As people start to think about their questions, we already have one from Noeli Guzman, who says, "Thank you for this rich analysis. I was wondering if you have any insights precisely on your third point, land and agrarian issues. While most discussions on Bolivian politics have revolved around lithium these past few years, I find that land redistribution via the agribusiness and cattle ranching is a more aggressively disputed front with immediate on-the-ground consequences for indigenous territories. How do you think Rodrigo Paz's political agenda differs from that of Camacho, Añez's, or Tuto Quirobo's?" And I can repeat any part of that if needed.
No. It makes sense. So thank you, Manueli, for the question. At this point, I don't know if we can say they're going to be that much different. The people that Rodrigo Paz appointed in those key positions were, again, part of the main organizations, economic organizations that run those businesses in the lowlands mainly. So in this sense, I mean, that would probably be the same thing that Añez or Tuto Quiroga or Camacho would have done. Probably the big difference is going to be that the rhetoric of Paz is not going to be as blatantly offensive or aggressive against indigenous peoples or the plurinational states, because I don't know if it's him or his party are more aware of the general diversity of the country, and they don't feel like they're probably more keen to understand that they don't have the power or the strength to mobilize such a strong discourse. But it sounds like for what we're seeing right now, and I hope to be wrong, to be honest, it sounds like they're going to move towards consolidating or expanding the agricultural frontier, not necessarily respecting the indigenous peoples or territories, and probably even going after the settlers that supported the mass and that have moved to those regions as well in order to start their lives under the promise of new spaces. So yeah, I don't think I think they're going to move against them. I guess the question is, or probably the difference, as I was saying, is going to be the degree of violence and aggressive rhetoric that we're going to hear from Paz in comparison to the other leaders that were mentioned in the question.
I guess I have a question then. I didn't introduce myself earlier. I'm Brian Pitts. I'm the assistant director of the Latin American Institute, and lived in Bolivia when I was a kid. So even though I studied Brazil, Bolivia is still high on my list of interest. It sounds like Paz has this really difficult balancing act, right? In that, he's traditionally aligned with the opposition, but like a lot of the things he would want to do are really fraught, right? Like he can't just like throw everybody from Mas in prison right now. He can't just, he can't demand the constitutional convention. So is there anything you talk about, because I think Bolivia has like such a long tradition of really strong indigenous and rural mobilization, right? That can shut the country down. It's been like that for a really long time, at least since the revolution in '52, if not the colonial period. So how, I mean, every Bolivian leader has to navigate this, right? And so how is he going to navigate like trying to strike the balance between like keeping his constituency on the right happy, but also not doing anything that would necessarily antagonize people, I want to say on the left, but certainly indigenous people in rural areas, people in El Alto, who could shut the country down if he puts a foot wrong?
That's a great question, and I think it speaks precisely to the history of Bolivian government. If there's one thing we've learned or we saw with the MNR back in 1952, with some of the military governments in the 1960s, but also in the return of the MNR in '85, and then the pacted democracy of the 1990s, is that there's a strong capacity to engage in clientelistic practices, and that's the way in which you can fracture or in which social organizations have been fractured in the past. The MAS did it as well, but probably more successfully, and mainly in a competition of different or internal competitions within social organizations. But I'm sure that they're also wondering how to operate in this environment, how not to upset the opposition and at the same time retain the support of the right or the conservatives in the country. And I think that if we can probably shift the question a little bit and ask what they are not going to do to get at least an idea of where they are going, I think that the experience of 2019, that was very openly anti-mass, with a ministry of government who was like threatening Evo Morales with prison and all his entourage or like their followers every day on the media, has proven to actually alienate people. So they're not going to take that approach. They're not going to go after the symbols. I don't think they're going to go after the plurinational state or the Wipala, even though they sort of recovered the idea of the Bible and the cross in the Legislative Assembly. I believe they probably did it because a large part of the supporters of the MAS are also evangelical, and there's working classes in Bolivia, indigenous peoples are either Catholic or evangelical, so they don't take a big hit as big as they would get in other parts of the world by putting the symbols back in the mainstream operation of the state. But I think they're going to be careful about those symbols, like the Wipala, the indigenous flag. They're not going to fully eliminate it, but it's also not going to take a central space, as we saw in the events on Saturday, right? Like the governmental palace had the Bolivian flag mostly. I think the Senate, the Legislative Assembly had a Wipala on the side, but it was not like visible at the beginning, or it didn't take like a prominent place as it used to have with Evo Morales and the MAS in general. So they're going to be careful. They're not going to try to antagonize people. And they're going to probably try to establish some pacts, clientelism. I think that's the way that politics has been done in Bolivia, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get into that again in order to fracture social organizations.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to emphasize like the complexity of sort of indigenous and working class identification with religious symbols on the one hand, like, Agnes with her Bible, but also with symbols like the huipala, right? Totally anecdotal, but the reason I lived in Bolivia as a kid is because my parents were missionaries, evangelical missionaries. And my dad went back a few years ago, visited some of the indigenous pastors we worked with, and like they have a huipala in their church, right? And so I just think it seems that like indigenous politics and working class politics aren't like straightforwardly right wing or left wing either necessarily.
Yeah. So interesting.
Sorry, Ruben, I don't know if you were about to speak.
Go ahead. Why don't you want if you have a question? I don't see a question in the Q&A, or if there's one, we should read it. Go ahead, Gabriel.
Yes, well, one has just appeared in the Q&A. So this is from Sammy Feldblum, who says, "Thank you so much for this talk. Very insightful. I joined a bit late, so may have missed this, but I'm curious why it seems that the center right has lost support to the far right elsewhere in South America, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, but has found political success in Bolivia."
I think there are two factors there. One of them, I think, is that we cannot explain Paz's victory without mentioning the collapse of the MAS administration under Arce. Like, Arce did such a terrible job, in part because he was undermined by the opposition, the traditional conservative opposition, but also by the members of the MAS who were aligned with Evo Morales, who wouldn't sign agreements for credits, especially after 2022, or even earlier, I would say. They were not really willing to push forward the agenda that the MAS administration had. It almost felt like as if Morales and his faction wanted Arce to fail so he could become the MAS candidate again. And they really undermined him. But of course, they also made like several mistakes, I would say. The issue of gas imports via creating this fake, I don't know how to call it, by this company that would buy natural gas abroad or oil gas abroad and then bring it to take it to Bolivia. Apparently, it generated a loss of $350 million, and all that. It has to be investigated. But so there were like mistakes of the administration that will explain why people started feeling like the MAS, or at least Arce's MAS, was not the right side, or the party that could take them out of those issues that I explained at the very beginning, which is like increasing prices, inflation everywhere, lack of access to gas, natural oil gas and diesel, not being able to mobilize to move around the city, and the lack of access to dollars in general, right? So those factors definitely played a role for Paz to win. I think the other factor is that he sort of managed to present himself as an outsider, and an outsider that was sort of speaking to the or a large part of the constituency of the MAS. And he did this in part thanks to his vice president, who apparently had generated lots of influence and followers on TikTok after he became a political figure for denouncing corruption within the police. But also went and visited small towns, like old style politics carried out face to face in small spaces, talking to people, hearing from their needs. And I know I'm probably sounding as a supporter of Paz here, but I really think that was probably key for his success. So all this to say that I'm not entirely sure that the label of center right really explains why he won, or why a center right candidate won this election. It was a candidate who spoke to the right population, maybe center left, maybe center right, maybe a little bit to the left, maybe a little bit to the right, but that did things differently from the other candidates, that engaged with people person to person, and that in the context of a declining MAS administration that did very bad, and also the possibility of returning to old-style, very conservative right-wing politics, I should add, like Tuto Quiroga, or more center-right as well, like Salvador Medina, seemed like the best candidate for people who wanted something new. It's like, we don't want the old, whether if it's the mass or the right-wing leaders that have participated in these elections for so long. This is why we're voting for pass.
Let me intervene here with my question, if I have the opportunity, very quickly. Jorge, you at the end of the talk started to say a little bit about the relation with the United States, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what this return of the U.S. to Bolivia, in a way, will mean for the country and certainly the government, the people of Bolivia.
Well, there is a portion of the population that has voted consistently against the mass, that has longed for the return of the DEA and for a friendlier relationship with the United States than the one we have with Evo Morales, which is now celebrating this return, right? Like this new engagement, renewed engagement, which again we saw as well with Áñez. In a much shorter time, but probably in a more volatile environment. What will this mean in terms of how we operate? I don't know. I think Paz is playing, or the administration is playing, again, another pragmatic move. Who can provide support, economic support for the current economic situation, or who is best to be aligned with for this current moment, is the United States. In part because they have the money, and in part because the people that are part of Paz's administration had also connections and nexus with these international organizations, like the World Bank and the CAF, the Corporación Andina de Fomento, and all that. This, of course, puts us again in the position of depending on what the US says about Bolivian efforts to fight against narco trafficking, like how much money we can get from abroad. So if there's one thing that we had with Morales was that keeping the US or a barrier with the US gave us a sense of sort of autonomy and greater independence, even though people will say that, well, we're still aligned to Russia or China on the multipolar bloc. But that seems to be coming to an end right now with Paz. And I think we're going to see more of a not interference, but intervention or participation of the US, either explicitly or behind closed curtains in the country, regarding economic policies, regarding the issues related to cocoa production. The only thing we can hope is that after all these 20 years, we learned to protect human rights, and hopefully the approach will not be the same that the government had under the auspice of the United States back in the late 1990s or early 2000s, which was highly repressive with lots of human costs. So in this context, I think it's the best thing that we can aspire to.
And we have a couple more questions coming in. First, from Cesar Bauli Castillo. Hello, Jorge. Thank you for this talk. If the shift to the right has much to do with urban discontent around gas and diesel prices and other aspects of economic stagnation, do you see the incoming administration having real prospects of delivering economic well-being to the urban, or are we likely to enter a period of alternation between right and left governments, as we have seen in Argentina, with no political project gaining the level of hegemony achieved by Morales and the MAS in the period of commodity boom in the 2000s?
I think that's a great question too. I would say it's too early to tell, but I think there are a few things to keep in mind. One of them is that this government, despite again having a significant representation in the Legislative Assembly and having ideological allies in full control of the legislative assembly is going to be of help, but it's still it's not a consolidated government like it was the NES. That also managed to translate that electoral power into strengthening their power. They were really good at reducing the influence of the opposition. I'm not sure if this government is going to be able to do the same thing, neither politically nor economically. I think we are sort of at the moment in which the first priority is the economy. Okay, we need to make sure that people get gas, that prices remain stable. And in order to do that, we need to find external sources of funding. So we're going to just focus on that thing. And as long as they do that, I think they're going to be okay. But from down the road, I don't know if they're going to be able to sustain the stability that they're aspiring to get in these first few months, especially when they decide, once they feel that they're stabilized, we have to see what they're going to try to do next. And I think among those things is like the new hydrocarbons law, the new, probably some reforms to the constitution, maybe going after the mass administration and representatives. We have to see how those actions are going to affect the balance of power and whether they're going to be able to retain it. And from the side of the left as well. I mean, Morales mobilized against Luis Arce, but did it on several occasions, and did it from a mostly weak position of weakness. He almost never managed to achieve what he wanted under those protests. One of the things being that he wanted to be running for president again, and he couldn't achieve that. So there's still some mobilization power, but it's not as strong as it used to be. And we'll have to see whether these forces can rearticulate as they did, for instance, in 2019, when they almost ousted Áñez, and they basically decided to stop mobilization in order to have elections and allow the mass to return to power, but they could have easily overthrown Áñez at that point. So I don't know. Maybe I don't know if we're going to follow the model of Argentina with Macri and Fernández, and then Fernández again, and then Milei, or if we're going to be able to see some more stability and have like consecutive terms from center-right governments and then left-leaning governments in the coming years. I think it's too early to tell for now.
And then we also have a question from Connie Jakith. Can you speak to any cohesive Bolivian perception of China and the United States?
I'm not sure I'm getting the question. Is this like how Bolivians in general perceive the US and China?
I think so, but Connie, if you want to clarify any more, please feel free to type more and I'll mention that.
I think, well, it depends on who party did you vote for in the elections. I think to a certain extent, to be honest. I think there's a long history of resentment or rejection of the U.S. as or the idea of an empire that sought to impose things, that sort of humiliated authorities and sort of designated what had to be done or not, or dictated what had to be done or not. This aside from all the intervention that we know very well and that has been documented and proven. So there's a faction or portion of Bolivian society who has a strong rejection to any intervention from the United States. But it does, at the same time, and probably because of the economic growth of the country, this is actually a point that Alvaro Garcia has made indirectly, and others, which is that with the well-being improving in certain portions of the population and the growth of the middle classes, then there's a sense of looking more to be part of a globalized society. And when you enter into that terrain, the aspirations to look like more developed countries, is stronger among these sectors of Bolivian society. So there are some portions of Bolivian society who see the United States as a model, who want to have like a stronger connection. And of course, this is aided by a sustained campaign in the media and by political partners who are always saying, well, we should be doing businesses with the United States. The most recent one is Marcelo Claure, this mogul who has millions, I don't know how many billions of dollars or billions of dollars, who endorsed one of the candidates in the first round, Salvador Medina, and who is very likely also involved in past administration. So I would say that the perception about the US and China is divided depending on who you talk to. And in the case of China, there are like people who would say that the disrespect to labor rights or the environment are some things to consider, especially when we talk about extractivism. So even on the left or on some sectors of the left, there's the sense there's not a cohesive view about China in certain aspects, even though we know that it's probably one of the main powers that could confront the United States or offer an alternative to a hegemonic world.
Okay. Thank you so much for the questions. It's now 2:01 p.m., so I think that we're going to wrap up. But thank you again, Jorge, for an excellent talk, and thank you for answering our questions, and thank you for asking questions. I think that we've all learned a lot, and we'll continue seeing what happens in Bolivia.
I hope you do. Thank you, and very nice to meet you all. And well, I hope you sometime get the opportunity to be here in Georgia. Again, in the case of Brian.
Muchas gracias. Y gracias a todos por